In the summer of 1996, Death Row Records looked almost impossible to stop. Tupac Shakur was producing music at an unbelievable pace. Snoop Dogg was already one of the biggest rappers alive. Dr. Dre had helped create the sound that changed West Coast hip-hop forever. Death Row albums were selling millions of copies. The label had money, influence, celebrity, and an image unlike anything the music industry had seen before. And standing in the middle of everything was Suge Knight, 6'2", former football player, bodyguard turned music executive. A man whose reputation eventually became almost as famous as the records his company released. Death Row didn't look like another record label. It looked like an empire. But underneath the platinum albums and expensive cars was a company becoming increasingly unstable. Artists were fighting over money. Dr. Dre was becoming uncomfortable with the environment around him. Tupac had enemies everywhere. Suge Knight was facing serious legal problems, and the same intimidating image that helped make Death Row powerful was becoming impossible to separate from the company's business. Then, within a matter of months, everything collapsed. Dr. Dre walked away. Tupac was murdered. Suge Knight went to prison. Snoop Dogg left. And one of the most dominant record labels in music history began falling apart almost as quickly as it had risen. So how did Death Row Records become powerful enough to change hip-hop? And how did a company containing Tupac, Snoop Dogg, and Dr. Dre manage to lose almost everything? Because the story of Death Row isn't simply the story of a record label that failed. It's the story of what happens when extraordinary talent, enormous money, personal loyalty, fear, and chaos all become part of the same business. And to understand how it ended, we have to go back to a completely different company. Ruthless Records. By the beginning of the 1990s, Dr. Dre had already helped revolutionize rap as a member of N.W.A. Straight Outta Compton had transformed the group into one of the most controversial acts in America. But behind the success, money was becoming a problem. Ice Cube had already left N.W.A. after disputes over finances. Dr. Dre eventually became dissatisfied too. He wanted out of his relationship with Ruthless Records and its co-founder, Eazy-E. This is where Suge Knight enters the story. Suge had worked as a bodyguard and had already begun navigating the music business. He saw something enormously valuable in Dre. Not simply a rapper, a producer capable of creating an entire sound. Dre wanted freedom. Suge believed he could help provide it. Exactly what happened during the negotiations surrounding Dre's departure has been argued about for decades, and some of the most dramatic stories have grown into hip-hop mythology. What isn't disputed is the result. Dr. Dre left Ruthless, and alongside Suge Knight and other partners, the foundation for Death Row Records was created. Then, something happened that instantly validated the entire idea. Dr. Dre made the Chronic. Released in December 1992, the Chronic didn't simply become successful. It changed what mainstream rap sounded like. The production was smooth, enormous, and instantly recognizable. G-Funk exploded, and one voice kept appearing throughout the album. A young rapper from Long Beach named Snoop Doggy Dogg. Snoop sounded completely different from Dre. Relaxed where Dre was forceful, almost effortless. His voice floated over the production. Listeners wanted more. Death Row suddenly had two of the most important artists in rap connected to the same label. Then came Doggystyle. Released in 1993, Snoop's debut became an enormous commercial success. Death Row wasn't slowly developing anymore. It had arrived. Think about how quickly this happened. The label barely existed. Then Dr. Dre releases The Chronic. Then Snoop releases Doggystyle. Two projects that helped define an era arrive almost back to back. Death Row becomes synonymous with West Coast rap, but the company's image was different from traditional music labels. Suge Knight wasn't trying to look like a corporate executive. Death Row embraced intimidation. Its artists were surrounded by people from Los Angeles street culture. Security, friends, gang affiliations, and business relationships frequently overlapped. The company's headquarters developed a reputation as an unpredictable place. Stories about confrontations and intimidation became part of Death Row mythology. Some are well documented, Others had been repeated so many times that separating fact from legend can be difficult. But the perception itself mattered. People believed death row was dangerous, and in entertainment, perception can become power. Imagine negotiating with a label whose chief executive already has a reputation for intimidation. Imagine being an artist considering a dispute over money. Imagine being another executive trying to challenge them. Death Row's image made the company fascinating to the public. But it also created a long-term problem. Fear is useful until everybody inside the building starts feeling it too. And while Death Row was becoming famous, Snoop Dogg was facing something much more serious than an industry dispute. In 1993, Snoop and his bodyguard McKinley were charged in connection with the killing of Philip Woldemariam. The case hung over Snoop during the period when his career was exploding. One of the biggest new rappers in America was simultaneously facing a murder trial. In February 1996, Snoop and Lee were acquitted of murder. For Death Row, it should have been a moment of relief. But by then, another problem was developing. Dr. Dre wanted out. The man whose production had effectively launched the label was increasingly dissatisfied with what Death Row had become. Dre later described being uncomfortable with the violence and chaos surrounding the company. He also had business disagreements, and eventually he made an extraordinary decision. He left. Think about that. Dr. Dre had helped build Death Row. His production had created its defining sound. The Chronic was foundational to the company's success, and he walked away from his stake in the label. In March 1996, Dre formed Aftermath Entertainment. At the time, walking away may have looked insane. Death Row was still enormous, and it had just acquired another artist who was about to make the company even bigger, Tupac Shakur. To understand why Tupac joining Death Row mattered so much, you have to understand where he was in 1995. Tupac was already a star. He had successful albums. He had starred in movies. He had become one of rap's most recognizable personalities, but he was also incarcerated. In December 1994, Tupac had been convicted of sexual abuse in New York. He maintained his innocence regarding the more serious allegations against him and was acquitted of some charges, but he was sentenced to prison. While his appeal was pending, Tupac needed significant money to secure his release on bond. Suge Knight saw an opportunity. Death Row helped arrange the financial backing that allowed Tupac to leave prison in October 1995 while his appeal proceeded. In return, Tupac signed with Death Row. It may have been the most consequential artist signing in the label's history, because Tupac didn't come out of prison ready to slowly rebuild his career. He came out furious, productive, paranoid, ambitious, and apparently determined to record as much music as physically possible. Almost immediately, he went into the studio. The result was All Eyez on Me. Released in February 1996, it became one of the defining albums of Tupac's career and another massive Death Row success. Now look at the label's roster. Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Tupac Shakur, at different moments in the same company's short history. That's absurd. Most record labels would consider themselves fortunate to build an era around one artist of that magnitude. Death Row had three, and Tupac brought something else. Conflict. The story began before Death Row. November 30th, 1994, Tupac enters Quad Recording Studios in Manhattan. Before reaching the upstairs studio, he is attacked and shot multiple times during a robbery. He survives. But afterward, Tupac becomes suspicious of people associated with New York's rap scene. Biggie Smalls and Sean Puff Daddy Combs denied involvement in the attack. No evidence established that Biggie ordered the shooting, but Tupac became convinced people around him knew more than they were saying. Then Biggie released Who Shot Ya? Biggie maintained the song had been recorded before Tupac was attacked. But to Tupac, hearing a record with that title while recovering from being shot felt personal. The relationship deteriorated. When Tupac joined Death Row, that personal conflict became attached to something much larger. Bad Boy Records represented New York. Death Row represented Los Angeles. Biggie was Bad Boy's biggest rapper. Tupac was now Death Row's biggest rapper. A personal feud became a label feud. A label feud became a regional feud, and the media had an irresistible story: East Coast versus West Coast. If you love hip-hop stories like this, like, comment, and subscribe, because the part of the Death Row story everybody remembers is what happened next. But what's incredible is how many warning signs appeared before everything finally collapsed. August 1995, the Source Awards in New York. Suge Knight walks on stage. He accepts an award. Then he delivers one of the most famous speeches in hip-hop history. Without directly naming Puff Daddy, Suge takes a shot at executives who appear in their artist videos and dance in their videos, and tells artists who don't want that to come to Death Row. The audience understands exactly what he's doing. The tension is no longer hidden. Death Row and Bad Boy are publicly antagonistic. Months later, Tupac escalates everything. June 1996. Hit 'em up. There is no ambiguity. Tupac directly attacks Biggie. He attacks Bad Boy. He attacks people around them. The song becomes one of the most vicious diss records ever released. And underneath the entertainment, the environment is getting more dangerous. That's important. Rap beef is not automatically real-world violence. Artists have insulted each other on record since the beginning of hip-hop. But the Death Row Bad Boy conflict was happening alongside real violence, real street affiliations, and real personal resentment. Those worlds were becoming dangerously close. Meanwhile, Dr. Dre was gone. That's one of the strangest details about Death Row's peak. At almost the exact moment Tupac was turning the label into an even bigger cultural force, one of its founders had decided the environment was no longer worth remaining inside. Then came September 7th, 1996, Las Vegas. Mike Tyson versus Bruce Seldon. Tupac and Suge Knight attend the fight at the MGM Grand. Tyson wins quickly. Afterward, Tupac and the Death Row entourage begin moving through the casino. Then someone spots Orlando Anderson. Anderson was a member of the Southside Compton Crips. A previous confrontation involving Anderson and Death Row associate Trevon Lane had allegedly occurred months earlier. Tupac approaches Anderson. Casino surveillance cameras capture what happens next. Tupac attacks it. Others join. Anderson is beaten on the floor. Security intervenes. Everybody separates. It lasts seconds. But those seconds become one of the most consequential moments in hip-hop history. Later that night, Tupac rides through Las Vegas in a black BMW driven by Suge Knight. They're heading toward Club 662. At approximately 11:15 p.m., the BMW stops near Flamingo Road and Cova Lane. A white Cadillac pulls alongside. Gunfire erupts. Tupac is hit multiple times. Suge is wounded. The Cadillac disappears. Tupac is rushed to the hospital. For 6 days, fans wait. Then on September 13th, 1996, Tupac Shakur dies. 25 years old. Death Row's biggest artist is gone, and Suge Knight was sitting beside him when it happened. It's difficult to overstate what Tupac's death did to Death Row. The company didn't simply lose a successful rapper, it lost its gravitational center. Tupac had been recording constantly. He generated headlines constantly. He created controversy constantly. He gave Death Row an almost unbelievable level of cultural attention. Then suddenly there was silence. But Suga had another immediate problem. The MGM Grand fight had been captured on surveillance. Suge was on probation from an earlier assault case. His participation in the confrontation created serious consequences. In 1997, his probation was revoked. Suge Knight was sent to prison. Now consider what's happened in roughly 1 year. Dr. Dre leaves. Tupac dies. Suge goes to prison. 3 of the central figures responsible for Death Row's power are suddenly gone from its daily operation, and Snoop Dogg is watching all of it happen. Snoop had already survived his murder trial. He had watched Dre leave. He had watched Tupac die. The atmosphere surrounding Death Row no longer looked like unstoppable success. It looked unstable. Snoop eventually wanted out too. In 1998, he left Death Row and signed with Master P's No Limit Records. That move was symbolic. Death Row had once looked like the most powerful destination in rap. Now one of its biggest stars was escaping to another independent empire, and Master P reportedly played an important role in helping Snoop navigate his way out. Snoop later spoke about how important that move was for his career and his life. So let's stop here and look at the scoreboard. The Chronic, gone with Dre. Doggystyle, Snoop is gone. All Eyez on Me, Tupac is dead. Suge Knight, in prison. How does a record label survive losing that much talent and leadership in such a short period? Death Row tried. There was still unreleased Tupac material. There were still artists connected to the company. There was still an enormously valuable catalog. The Death Row name itself remained famous, but the momentum was gone. And another problem was becoming increasingly important: money. For all the records Death Row sold, disputes over finances followed the company. Artists and producers complained about royalties and compensation. Lawsuits accumulated. Former associates made claims. Legal costs mounted, and the company's complicated ownership history created additional problems. This is one of the great contradictions of Death Row. From the outside, the label looked unimaginably wealthy. Luxury cars, jewelry, parties, private security, millions of albums sold. But selling millions of records doesn't automatically mean a company is financially healthy. Revenue isn't profit. Artists have to be paid. Producers have to be paid. Distributors take money. Lawyers take money. Videos cost money. Advances cost money. Advances cost money. Security cost money. Lawsuits cost a lot of money. And when the person at the center of the operation is incarcerated, managing all of that becomes even harder. Death Row's distribution relationship with Interscope had also become controversial. The political backlash against gangster rap was enormous. Activists targeted Time Warner over its connection to Interscope and Death Row. The label wasn't simply a music company anymore. It had become a national symbol in arguments about violence, lyrics, and corporate responsibility. Eventually, Death Row's relationship with major corporate partners changed. The machine that helped distribute the music was becoming less stable at the exact moment the roster was disintegrating. Then there's something even more important. Death Row lost its creative engine. Dr. Bice. Dre wasn't just another artist. He was a producer who could shape entire albums. Aftermath initially struggled, but eventually Dre found another young rapper, Eminem. Then came 2001, then 50 Cent. The producer who had walked away from Death Row went on to build another extraordinary chapter of hip-hop history. Snoop rebuilt too. His move to No Limit helped reposition him. Eventually, Snoop became something almost nobody could have predicted during the chaos of the 1990s. One of the most universally recognizable personalities in entertainment, Tupac's legacy grew after his death. Posthumous albums continued selling. His image became iconic. His influence expanded across generations. Almost everyone central to Death Row's creative success found a second life outside the company, except Death Row itself. And Suge Knight's problems continued. After being released from prison, he attempted to rebuild the label, but the industry had changed. The artists were gone. The relationships were different. The mystique remained, but mystique doesn't make hit records by itself. There were attempts to introduce new artists. There were unreleased recordings. There were compilations. But recreating the early Death Row formula was almost impossible, because the original formula wasn't actually a formula. It was a freak collision of talent. Dr. Dre at one of the most important creative moments of his career. Snoop Dogg arriving with a voice nobody had heard before. Tupac entering the most productive and explosive period of his life. And Suge Knight possessing the ambition and force necessary to put all of it under one roof. You can't simply hire replacements for that. Then the lawsuits became overwhelming. One of the most consequential came from Lydia Harris. Her former husband, Michael Harrio Harris, had been associated with the early financing of Death Row. Lydia Harris argued that she had been improperly excluded from the company. A court eventually awarded her a massive judgment. Other financial claims surrounded Death Row as well. By 2006, the situation reached the point Suge Knight and Death Row filed for bankruptcy. Think about the arc. 1992, The Chronic. 1993. Doggystyle, 1995. Tupac joins. 1996. All Eyez on Me. 10 years after the Chronic helped establish Death Row as a powerhouse. Bankruptcy. That's an astonishingly short lifespan for a company that permanently changed popular music. And this is where the Death Row story becomes more than nostalgia, because the collapse wasn't caused by one thing. People sometimes want one villain, one bad contract, one murder, one decision, but Death Row's implosion was a chain reaction. Dr. Dre leaving weakened the creative foundation. Tupac's death removed the label's most explosive star. Suge's incarceration removed its central executive. Snoop's departure eliminated another superstar. Financial disputes damaged relationships. Lawsuits drained resources. Corporate distribution became complicated, and the company's intimidating culture made long-term stability harder. The very things that made Death Row exciting were connected to the things that made it fragile. Aggression created attention, but aggression also created enemies. Loyalty created a powerful inner circle, but loyalty based on fear can disappear when circumstances change. Extravagance created an image of success, but extravagant spending can destroy businesses. Controversy sold records, but controversy also attracted police, lawsuits, politicians, and media scrutiny. Death Row wasn't destroyed by something completely separate from its identity. In many ways, the weaknesses were embedded inside the strength from the beginning. If you love hip-hop stories like this, like, comment, and subscribe. And let me know what part of Death Row history deserves its own deep dive, because almost every major character in this story has enough history for an entire documentary. But the story gets stranger after the bankruptcy, because Death Row might have collapsed as a functioning label, but its catalog was still enormously valuable. Those recordings didn't disappear. The Chronic, Doggystyle, All Eyez on Me, The Donk Illuminati, The 7-Day Theory, soundtracks, singles, unreleased recordings, some of the most important music of the 1990s. Ownership of the Death Row assets began changing hands. The catalog and trademarks moved through bankruptcy proceedings and subsequent acquisitions. The company that had once been defined by Suge Knight became something that could be bought and sold without him. That's a remarkable ending by itself. Suge built an empire around control. Eventually, he lost control of the empire's name, and his personal story became even darker. Years after Death Row's peak, Suge remained a celebrity largely because of what he had once represented, but legal trouble continued following him. Then came January 2015. During a confrontation in Compton, Suge Knight drove a vehicle into two men, killing Terry Carter and injuring Cleve "Bone" Sloan. Suge maintained that he had feared for his life during the confrontation. He was charged with murder and other offenses. In 2018, Knight pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter. He received a 28-year prison sentence. The man who once stood on stage telling artists to come to Death Row was now going to spend decades behind bars. But Death Row itself wasn't finished. Because decades after the company's original rise, something happened that would have sounded impossible in 1996. Snoop Dogg bought Death Row Records. In 2022, Snoop announced that he had acquired the Death Row brand from N.W.A Music Group. The exact rights associated with the broader catalog have involved separate ownership arrangements and complexities over time, but symbolically, the moment was enormous. The young rapper whose debut helped turn Death Row into an empire, the artist who eventually became desperate to leave, now controlled the label's brand. Think about that full circle. Snoop enters Death Row as a young artist, becomes a superstar, watches the company descend into chaos, leaves, builds an enormous career elsewhere, then decades later returns not as an artist under Death Row, but as an owner. That's an ending Hollywood would probably reject for being too obvious, but it happened, and it raises the biggest question in this entire story. What was Death Row Records actually worth? Not financially, culturally. Because if you only judge the company by longevity, Death Row was a disaster. Its golden period was incredibly short. Its biggest artist left or died. Its founder went to prison. The company eventually entered bankruptcy. Ownership changed repeatedly. But if you judge Death Row by influence, the answer is completely different. The label helped define the sound of West Coast hip-hop. It helped turn Dr. Panzer's Dre into one of the most important producers in modern music. It introduced the world to Snoop Dogg. It gave Tupac the platform for the most commercially explosive period of his career. Its visual identity became iconic. Its logo became one of the most recognizable images in rap. Its conflicts shaped the way an entire generation remembers the 1990s. Even people who weren't alive when Death Row dominated can recognize the name. That's extraordinary. There are successful record labels that operated for decades without creating that kind of mythology. Death Row did it in a few years, but mythology creates another problem. Eventually, the stories become bigger than the facts. You've probably heard dozens of Death Row stories. People being threatened, artists being beaten, executives being intimidated, studio confrontations, gang politics, secret meetings, money disappearing. Some incidents are documented. Others come from people remembering events decades later. Some have probably been exaggerated, and some may never be completely resolved. That's why the documented timeline is already remarkable enough. You don't need every rumor. Look at what actually happened. Dr. Dre leaves N.W.A. Suge helps build a new company around him. The Chronic transforms rap. Snoop becomes a superstar. Death Row becomes the center of West Coast hip-hop. Snoop faces a murder trial and is acquitted. Tupac is incarcerated. Suge helps facilitate his release on bond. Tupac signs to Death Row. All Eyez on Me becomes enormous. Dre leaves. Tupac's conflict with Biggie and Bad Boy intensifies. Tupac attacks Orlando Anderson inside the MGM Grand. Hours later, Tupac is shot while riding beside Suge. Tupac dies. Suge's probation is revoked. Suge goes to prison. Snoop leaves. The hits slow down. Lawsuits accumulate. Death Row enters bankruptcy. Suge eventually receives a 28-year prison sentence in an unrelated later case. And decades later, Snoop Dogg acquires the Death Row brand. You could invent a record label drama with half of those events and people would call it unrealistic. And that's why Death Row remains fascinating. At its peak, it represented the fantasy of complete independence and control. Artists making uncompromising music. A black-owned rap powerhouse challenging the traditional music establishment. Enormous records. Enormous personalities. Nobody asking permission. But control was also the thing Death Row ultimately couldn't maintain. It couldn't keep Dre. It couldn't protect Tupac. It couldn't keep Snoop. It couldn't keep Snoop. It couldn't keep Snoop out of prison. It couldn't keep its finances stable. And eventually it couldn't even keep ownership of its own name. Maybe the most important moment in Death Row's history isn't Tupac signing, or Dre leaving, or even Tupac's murder. Maybe it's something much quieter. Dr. Dre deciding to walk away while the company was still successful. Because Dre had something almost nobody else inside Death Row possessed at that moment. He could see what success was costing him. Imagine leaving a company you helped create while it's dominating music. Walking away from money. Walking away from one of the biggest labels in rap. Starting again. That's an enormous gamble, and history tells us what happened. Dre survived. Snoop eventually left and survived. The artists who separated their futures from Death Row built new lives. The company didn't, and Tupac never got the opportunity to make that decision. There have been conflicting accounts over the years about Tupac's long-term intentions toward Death Row and his plans for his own ventures. We can't know exactly what would have happened if he had survived Las Vegas. That's one of the great unanswered questions. Would Tupac have stayed? Would he have eventually left? Would he and Suge have remained close? Would Machiavelli have become the foundation of something completely separate? Would the East Coast-West Coast conflict have cooled down? Nobody knows. Tupac was 25. His story stopped before we could find out. But Death Row continued long enough to show us something else. Talent can make a company powerful very quickly. It cannot make a company stable. For that, you need structure, trust, accounting, contracts people believe in, leadership that can survive conflict, an environment where talented people actually want to stay. Death Row had extraordinary talent. It had extraordinary marketing. It had extraordinary cultural instincts. But stability? That was the missing ingredient. And once the original personalities disappeared, there wasn't enough structure left to replace them. That's why I don't think Death Row's story is simply a cautionary tale about violence. That's too easy. It's a business story. It's a story about incentives. Suge understood the value of ownership before many rappers were openly discussing it. He understood that controlling the company was more powerful than simply being an employee of somebody else's company. That idea was ahead of its time, but ownership alone isn't enough. You have to build something people trust enough to remain part of, and fear is a terrible substitute for trust. Maybe fear gets somebody into a meeting. Maybe it ends an argument. Maybe it creates a reputation. But eventually, the person you're trying to control becomes successful enough to leave. Dre did, Snoop did, and when they left, they took something Death Row couldn't replace, themselves. There is one more irony. Death Row's biggest artists eventually became bigger than Death Row. Dr. Dre became an entrepreneur and producer whose influence stretched into another generation of superstars. Snoop became a global celebrity. Tupac became an icon whose cultural importance expanded after his death. Their identities survived the label. Meanwhile, Suge Knight became inseparable from the mythology of what went wrong. That's probably unfair if interpreted as saying one person caused every failure. He didn't. Death Row's collapse involved many people, many decisions and circumstances no executive could completely control. But Suge wanted to be the face of the company. And being the face means you become attached to both the victories and the consequences. In 1995, standing at the Source Awards, Suge looked like the head of a company taking over hip-hop. A year later, Dr. Dre was gone. Tupac was dead. Months after that, Suge was in prison. Then Snoop left. The empire didn't collapse over 20 years. The heart of it collapsed almost overnight. And that's what makes Death Row different. It wasn't a slow decline nobody noticed. People watched it happen. The biggest stars in rap, the biggest beef in rap, one of the biggest unsolved murders in music history, one of the most recognizable executives in entertainment. Everything happened in public, and the cameras never stopped. If you love hip-hop stories, like, comment, and subscribe, because we're going much deeper with these longer stories. And if you made it this far, tell me something in the comments. What do you think actually destroyed Death Row Records? Was it Suge Knight? Was it the violence surrounding the company? Was it losing Dr. Dre? Was Tupac's death the point of no return? Was it bad business? Or was Death Row simply built in a way that could never have lasted? Because I think the answer is more interesting than blaming one person. Death Row was built for impact, not longevity. Everything about it was immediate. The music, the personalities, the spending, the conflicts, the marketing, the lifestyle, the danger. For a few years, that intensity made Death Row seem more powerful than everybody else. Then the same intensity burned through the people holding it together. Dr. Dre recognized it and left. Tupac died before anyone could know what his next chapter would have been. Snoop escaped and rebuilt. Suge kept fighting until eventually there was almost nothing left to fight over, and Death Row became something strange. A company that failed, and a brand that became immortal. Because we're still talking about it. We're still playing the albums. We're still debating the relationships. We're still examining what happened in Las Vegas. We're still arguing about Tupac and Biggie. We're still telling stories about Suge. We're still watching interviews with people who walked through those offices 30 years ago. And younger generations who never experienced Death Row at its peak still recognize that electric chair logo immediately. That's not normal failure. That's legacy. The original Death Row empire is gone, but the mythology it created became bigger than the company ever was. Maybe that's the final contradiction. Suge Knight built Death Row because he wanted control. Control of the music. Control of the music. Control of the money. Control of the artists. Control of the image. For a moment, it worked. Death Row controlled the conversation. Then Dre left. Tupac died. Snoop left. Suge went to prison. The company went bankrupt. And eventually the label itself passed into other hands. Death Row conquered hip-hop, but it couldn't conquer itself. And that is how one of the most powerful record labels rap had ever seen became one of its greatest cautionary stories.